This May 13th, 1957 Life magazine article announced to the general public in North America the existence of mushrooms that cause strange visions. The story is the result of 3 trips to Mexico by investment banker R. Gordon Wasson to learn about and experience magic mushrooms. And here is R. Gordon Wasson in Mexico with curandera Eva Mendez taking his 6th pair of mushrooms. The Life magazine article contained watercolors of the 7 species of mushrooms that were known by the curanderas of Mexico to cause strange visions. And these illustrations became the guide to seekers of magic mushrooms who then flooded Mexico in search of the kind of experiences recorded by Wasson in the Life magazine article. Cannabis saliginoides was collected by Wasson in 1955 and was later found to contain psilocybin and psilocin by Dr. Albert Hofmann, a Swiss biochemist, the person who actually had discovered LSD. And Hofmann also was the person who determined the structure and presence of psilocybin and psilocin in these Mexican species. Most prized of all was Psilocybe mexicana, which grows in pastures and is very similar in general shape to the Liberty cap that we find in the Pacific Northwest, which also grows in pastures. Psilocybe aztecorum is another species that grows in grass. It's found on the volcano Popocatépetl. Psilocybe zapotecorum, which is now known as Psilocybe hochschageni, is another one of the magic mushrooms that seekers of the altered states of consciousness pursued in Mexico. Psilocybe cereulescens was the mushroom that Wasson actually consumed on his trips with curandera Eva Mendez Maria Sabina. And here's Psilocybe cereulescens in the flesh, the actual mushrooms rather than a watercolor. And Psilocybe cubensis, this is by far the largest of these mushrooms, and this one grows on dung, and indeed it's found worldwide on dung of all species, elephants, donkeys, horses, cattle. Shortly after the Life magazine article appeared, Dr. Timothy Leary and Dr. Richard Alpert, both psychologists, had been hired by Harvard to shape up the psychology department. And soon thereafter, Timothy Leary traveled to Mexico to experience these mushrooms that cause strange visions. And in Mexico, he was able to obtain and consume Psilocybe cubensis, though not able to obtain the more powerful and more interesting mushrooms that Dr. Wasson had experienced. On his return to Harvard, Timothy Leary was able to obtain pure psilocybin from Dr. Hofmann in Switzerland and set up a research program to see what the effects of these mushrooms would be on individuals. They looked at religious practitioners, they looked at prisoners, and they became famous for sex-oriented orgies among their graduate students. Meanwhile, Dr. soon to become Andrew Weil wrote in the Harvard Crimson exposing the work of Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary because Dr. Weil wanted to experience these mushrooms himself, and he was an undergraduate, but wound up bringing down the house on Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who were both fired from their positions at Harvard. Now, Richard Alpert had disappeared to India, where he changed his name to Ram Das, which means servant of God. Originally, I didn't pay much attention to that name, Ram Dass, because Richard Alpert had been a non-practicing Jew, but these mushrooms opened his eyes to religion. And I much later in life did get to meet Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary as well. Now, in 1975, Paul Stamets and Jeremy Bigwood both showed up at my office interested in studying mushrooms. And Jonathan Ott also showed up interested in studying the chemistry of mushrooms in particular. And Jonathan became very, very close friends of Albert Hofmann, and indeed translated his German published book on LSD, My Problem Child, to English. And both Jonathan Ott and Jeremy Bigwood published another number of books on hallucinogenic plants in general, but they largely both focused on mushrooms. Jonathan stayed with me just for a year and then left to go to the University of Washington, where he pursued research on Amanita muscaria, another mind-altering compound. Paul and Jeremy worked with me throughout their undergraduate career. So Paul stayed with me for 4 years, Jeremy a total of 6. Jeremy wound up disappearing, leaving without a degree. Paul graduated after 4 years and publishing 2 books for his senior thesis, one book on psilocybin mushrooms and their allies, and the other book on mushroom cultivation. And here we see the field next to the house where I lived in Olympia, and students out looking for the Liberty Cap mushroom, Psilocybe semilanceata, which grew abundantly in that field. Here's Psilocybe semilanceata. Working with Jeremy, I collected and dried, and we extracted the chemicals from these mushrooms. And I was able to determine that Psilocybe semilanceata is fairly consistently right around 1% by dry weight psilocybin, and I never did find any psilocin present in this mushroom. And we realize now that psilocin, when it breaks down, causes the bluing reaction. And these mushrooms, because they don't have psilocin, or a Psilocybe species that does not blue. And yet they're very distinctive with their purple-brown spore print, the little nipple at the very apex of the cap, and their tendency to grow in boggy pastures, often with reeds present. They do not grow on dung. They are a grass associate. And here's Psilocybe subfimentarius, which is very similar to the Liberty Cap, and also very similar in the chemistry, about 1% by dry weight psilocybin. Now, Psilocybe baeocystis at the time was very, very common on the Evergreen campus. In fact, I even remember one time when Daniel Evans, who was then the governor of Washington, called me wondering what all the people were doing on the Capitol grounds, sniffing around in the beauty bark outside of his office. And they were pursuing Psilocybe baeocystis and another mushroom that grows in beauty bark in the Northwest, Psilocybe cyanescens, both of which were present on the Evergreen campus as well as the Olympia Capitol campus. Psilocybe baeocystis is not as strong as the Liberty Cap. It tends to be more like 0.5% to 1% psilocybin plus psilocin. And the other curious thing about baeocystis, it seemed to appear about when Jeremy Bigwood arrived on campus, and it disappeared within a few years of his departure. And it pretty much hasn't been seen anywhere on the West Coast in recent years. Here's Psilocybe cyanescens, another wood chip inhabitor. This one can reach up to 2% by dry weight. And we probably should have cyanescence in parentheses. This species is going to need a new name because it is distinct from the European psilocybe cyanescens, on which the name was originally based. And so our species is going to need a new name. But it contains both psilocybin and psilocin and averages right around 2% total dry weight. And it also has a little bit of baeocystin in it. There's another compound that I think increases the visual effects of the mushrooms. Psilocybe stuntzii grows generally in grassy fields, although this is shown growing in wood chips in my backyard in Olympia. Since I was doing research with these mushrooms, I would come home literally covered in spores, and my yard became a major cultivation ground quite accidentally. It wasn't intentional for psilocybe species. But I remember one year getting a call from the prison at Shelton, wondering why all the prisoners were on their hands and knees in the grounds in the fall, what was going on. They were pursuing predominantly Psilocybe stuntzii, which likes to grow on football fields, soccer fields, school playgrounds, college playgrounds, and was growing in considerable abundance there in Shelton in the grass. Now, this one is not a very active mushroom, but it grows in tremendous abundance. It's known commonly as the blue ringer because it contains psilocybin and psilocin, and it does tend to stay in blue. It's generally between 0.3 and 0.5% psilocybin plus psilocin combined. So it's a lot weaker, but sometimes can be found literally by the thousands. And it was named by one of my students, Jonathan Ott, in honor of Dr. Daniel Stuntz, the mycologist at the University of Washington, because in those days it grew literally by the thousands in the grass outside of the botany department at the University of Washington. That area now is all covered in red pavers, and the grass is gone and the mushrooms are gone. But Dr. Stuntz never forgave Jonathan for naming this mushroom after him. He did not want a magic mushroom, a hallucinogenic or psychedelic or mind-altering mushroom, whatever term you prefer, associated with his name. And here's Psilocybe cyanofibrillosa. It was named by Paul Stamets. I did the chemistry for it. It's a medium strength mushroom. Again, it's very similar to Baeocystis. We found this growing by the tens of thousands, literally, in the rhododendron gardens at the headquarters of Weyerhaeuser, which lie between Olympia and Tacoma. I should say between Seattle and Tacoma. But the rhododendron associated, but what was causing the mushroom's presence was all of the beauty bark. The most potent of all of the psilocybe mushrooms was one that I have never actually analyzed myself because it wasn't discovered until after Paul had graduated and had left Evergreen, and I had quit doing research on psilocybin mushrooms. But Psilocybe azurescens, which Paul calls spaceships, because they look a lot like, or UFOs, they look a lot like a theoretical UFO, is the most potent of all of the mushrooms with significant amounts of psilocybin and psilocin, over 2% by dry weight, plus significant amounts of baeocystin. It was discovered in the dune grass at the mouth of the Columbia River. But people have since discovered if you just break off a little piece of the stem and put the stem in a pile of wood chips, you can cultivate this mushroom and keep it growing for years and years in cultivation. The same is also true of Psilocybe cyanescens. If you find one, you find the whole thing, you break off the bottom of the stem and plant it in wood chips, and keep it watered and tended, you'll get a crop of Psilocybe cyanescens. So psilocybe azurescens is now found quite widespread as people have moved it around. It is a little bit more dangerous than the other mushrooms because it can cause temporary paralysis, but the paralysis can last an hour or two after consuming the mushrooms. And one of the concerns is that people out in the field might consume these mushrooms on a cold, wet, rainy day and suffer hypothermia before they can get back to their vehicle. Psilocybe alleni is another mushroom that was named years later after I had completed all of my psilocybin research. It's a powerful magic mushroom, also a wood chip inhabitor. It was believed to originally grow in the dune grass on the coast of California, from the central coast. Psilocybin and psilocin are both present. It grows in great abundance in Golden Gate Park as well. And like psilocybe azurescens, this mushroom has been spread very, very widely because, again, just a piece of the bottom of the stem placed in beauty bark, and you can create a bed of these mushrooms. Psilocybe folliculosa is one of the few psilocybe species that I am confident is totally native to the Northwest, but it is a very, very weak mushroom, typically containing about 0.1% psilocybin and psilocin. It's a little bit hard to identify because it doesn't blue significantly and it's not very active. You need to be very careful with it so you don't get a deadly look-alike. And here's Psilocybe cubensis, the mushroom that grows on dung. And this is the only psilocybe species that we have in the Pacific, well, I should say in North America, that grows on dung. All the others are either grassland species or growing on wood chips. And Psilocybe cubensis is a good sized mushroom, very easy to cultivate. On average, it's about 0.5% psilocybin plus psilocin, but I have found it very, very weak sometimes at 0.1%, and there are cultures that will produce levels of psilocybin plus psilocin of more like 1.2 to 1.3%. Psilocybe cubensis then is the most often consumed of these mushrooms because of how easy it is to cultivate, and it's quite large. It's typically about the size of the store-bought Agaricus campestris, Agaricus root. So soon after arriving at Evergreen, the students organized a series of conferences about hallucinogenic mushrooms. The very first image in the top left is Scott Chilton, who is one of my professors at the University of Washington, and the professor that Jonathan Ott left Evergreen to go work with, and he was researching Amanita muscaria. He's talking to Dr. Gaston Guzman, the monographer of the genus Psilocybe, who came from Mexico to attend the first international conference. The photograph is taken at Miller, Sylvania, at the Environmental Learning Center there. This was the very first international conference in the spring of 1976. The following year, they had the international conference up at Port Angeles. The year after that, moved it to Orcas Island, and then for a number of years following, these annual conferences were held at Brighton Bush Hot Spring Resort. So in the second photograph on the top right, see Gary Menser and Dale Leslie, which were two friends of mine who were very, very interested. They're Oregonians, very interested in mushrooms in general, but the mushrooms that cause strange visions in particular fascinated them. Talking with Dr. Daniel Stuntz and Gaston Guzman, and Dr. Stuntz was one of my major mentors, along with Kit Skates, who got me started studying mushrooms. Now, down on the bottom left, on the very far left, is Andrew Weil. This photograph is taken at one of the Brighton Bush conferences. almost every year, in fact, I'm sure every year, Gary Linkoff would come and attend these magic mushroom conferences. Gary lived in New York City, and he wrote the Ottoman Guide to Mushrooms and many other mushroom guides. He was a total mushroom fanatic, and he's visiting with Dr. Alexander H. Smith, who was basically a competitor of Roger M. and who published some of the psilocybe mushrooms himself. But Dr. Smith was one of the premier mycologists when I was just beginning. And on the bottom right is Stephen Pollack, who was a Texas medical doctor who would come to these conferences. He was later, while on a phone call to Paul Stamets, he got his doorbell rang, he left, he went to the door, answered the door. He was shot and killed, and it turns out it was by a Texas policeman, because the tape that records the whole thing was found a number of years later, although that Texas policeman was never charged for the murder, but he bragged about the killing of that hallucinogenic mushroom doctor. Paul got very fascinated by the use of the scanning electron microscope at Evergreen, and because almost nobody else was using it, and we could get massive number of hours on that machine, Dr. Alex Smith would come from Michigan to work with us and get to see mushrooms on the scanning electron microscope, because at that point SEMs were sufficiently new and sufficiently rare that they just weren't available to mycologists in general. And so we became a very popular focal point for Dr. Alex Smith to come out and look at the images of these mushrooms under the scanning electron microscope. And in the photograph is a single basidium of now what we'll call Panellus fonsecae. The Paniolina turned out to fit right in the middle of the genus Panellus, so that genus is gone. Panellus fonsecae, and there's the spores under scanning electron microscope. Each of those spores is about 10 microns long. The color is purely artificial. It had to do with because the mushrooms are dried, critically point dried, and then gold plated, and then put in the scanning electron microscope. Now, this is also a very active period of writing about magic mushrooms. You have Soma, the divine mushroom of immortality. R. Gordon Wasson had believed that Amanita muscaria was the plant Soma mentioned in the Rig Veda that induced religious experiences. That theory has been totally and thoroughly debunked. But it still was a very, very popular book that Wasson had put out. But he was determined to prove, he had decided in advance that muscaria must have been Soma, but it isn't. And we still don't really know what Soma was. This is one of Jonathan Ott's next book, one of his early books, Hallucinogenic Plants of North America. The LSD book from Hoffman that Jonathan translated in English. The Mushroom Cultivator, one of two books that Paul Stamets wrote for his senior thesis, Psilocybe Mushrooms and Their Allies, which was the second book. And then Jonathan Ott and Jeremy teamed up on Teonatocotl, Hallucinogenic Mushrooms in North America. And then some other folks, Richard Schultes, Albert Hoffman, and Christian Rach, who wrote Plants of the Gods. I later got to meet Christian at Breitenbush. And then The Road to Eleusis with R. Gordon Wasson, Hoffman, and Ruck, all of whom at one point or another attended some of these international conferences that the Evergreen students were involved with from about 1976 to about 1985, when these conferences were held annually. Now, what was once the genus Psilocybe contained some mushrooms that have no psilocybin and psilocin. And all of these mushrooms have been moved to a new genus, the Conica, to separate them from the mushrooms that are hallucinogenic. Now, there are mushrooms that aren't in the genus Psilocybe that they contain psilocybin and psilocin. One of the better known is Pandanus cyanescens. Now, this is primarily a species that is found in Hawaii and in tropical areas, but there happened to be in Olympia a person who got horse manure from stables, and it turned out the stables were bringing up horses from Florida, and so that the manure was rich in the spores of these mushrooms. And this guy was fertilizing his rhododendron gardens with wood chips and horse manure, and he had Pandanus cyanescens growing in his yard out by Tenino, and he also had Psilocybe cubensis, and he got very seriously into growing large amounts of these mushrooms and marketing them, and wound up in prison as a result. But I used to visit him and get photographs of his mushrooms as they were growing in his yard. Here's Pandanus papilionaceus. It's gone by many different names: Pandanus retirugus, Pandanus campanulatus. This is often eaten by psilocybe seekers, thinking that hallucinogenic mushrooms grow on dung. This is inactive. It can cause some strange reactions, but that's probably just from the urine or from getting peed on by the cattle in the fields. It is not an active mushroom. But Pandanus subalteatus is a Pandanus species that does bloom slightly. It's a grassland and a woodland species, and it's a mildly active mushroom at about 0.5% psilocybin and psilocin. Pandanus fonsecii was long thought to be a magic mushroom and is reported to be hallucinogenic in some parts of North America. I've analyzed hundreds of samples and never found any psilocybin or psilocin in this mushroom. But this is the mushroom that is frequently consumed by small children because it grows in yards, and it does cause tremendous panic among the parents when they find a half-eaten Pandanus hanging out of their toddler's mouth. And in the Midwest and in the East Coast, there is a look-alike that has small amounts of psilocybin, and so toddlers sometimes do wind up with psilocybin in their system, and probably not from Pandanus fonsecii, but from a look-alike that I haven't been able to figure out. It's important to know that children younger than 5 can get very high fevers from psilocybin and psilocin, and there's even been one death from an extreme fever of a young child from psilocybin and psilocin. So this is a very dangerous mushroom for very young children. There's Conocybe cyanopus, a blueing mushroom. I only found it on one occasion near Puyallup, and it's mildly hallucinogenic at about 0.3% psilocybin and psilocin. But what you have to watch out for is to be able to tell the psilocybe species on the right from the deadly poison Galerina autumnalis on the left. We actually have 2 species of Galerina that are deadly and contain alpha-mannan. Galerina autumnalis, which has a peelable cap cuticle, and psilocybe has a peelable cap cuticle, and Galerina marginalis, which looks very similar, but the cap cuticle is not peelable. Autumnalis has a rusty brown spore print, and if you look at the far left mushroom, sort of up the upper third of the stem, you see some light brown coloration. That's the spore print that is where the spores have gathered on the ring of the Galerina. Now, there have been deaths in the Northwest from psilocybe seekers who did not know how to distinguish the deadly Galerinas from the mind-altering psilocybe species. So make sure you know how to identify Galerinas and certain species of Conocybe that also have a ring and can cause death. And here's another photograph of the Galerina marginata or autumnalis. I didn't peel the cap cuticle of this, so I'm not sure which one it is. It's probably autumnalis, but not positive. And it's hygrophilous. In other words, it starts out very, very dark in color, but it's sort of and then it goes to tan as it loses moisture. Psilocybe mushrooms are also hygrophilous. They start out darker color, but usually not this orangey brown. They're more of a purpley brown, even on the top. And of course, the psilocybes will have a purple brown spore print, where these mushrooms have a rusty brown spore print. Now here's the Conocybe phalaris, which is also deadly poisonous. We have no reports of anyone having eaten this thing and no poisonings, but it contains alpha-amanitin, which is exactly the same toxin as the Galerina marginata, Galerina autumnalis, but also Amanita phalloides, Amanita ocreata, and the other deadly poisonous Amanita species. Now, here's a Gymnopolis, and notice the greenish staining. So blue on orange gives a green coloration, and this has significant amounts of psilocybin in it. This is a woodland mushroom that grows in the woods, and I found it at Brighton Bush and other places from time to time, and I've also found it growing in great quantities on piles of wood chips. But it's incredibly bitter. So it's not a pleasant mushroom to eat, although some people do eat it in order to experience the mind-altering effects of psilocybin. And here's Gymnopolis luteifolius, another mushroom that you find in the woods, growing on logs. But this used to grow at the steam sauna at Brighton Bush, on the walls of the steam sauna, which was all wood, and it grows on wood chips as well. The greenish color, it tells you right away that this mushroom has psilocybin and psilocin. Now, there are a lot of mushrooms that are naturally green, so you need to be looking for the blue-green staining. This is a natural blue-green color. This is Gymnopolis spectabilis, which has also been known as Gymnopolis junoneus, and it's an East Coast mushroom, and it is quite hallucinogenic, but also exceptionally bitter. And it has the common name Big Laughing Jim. There's a case in Japan that's very interesting where this housewife cooked a bunch of these up for dinner and consumed them, and then about an hour later she was seen singing and dancing naked down the street, just happy as all get out. And how she managed to choke down these very, very bitter mushrooms is a mystery. Now, we have an exact like in the Pacific Northwest. I'm sorry, I thought I had a picture of that. But the lookalike does not contain any psilocybin or psilocin. But Pluteus salicinus will sometimes be slightly bluing, and it does contain psilocybin and psilocin. Now, Pluteus species are generally collected as edibles. They're not great edibles, but they're okay. The interesting thing about the laws regarding psilocybin and psilocin is it doesn't matter whether or not you know the mushroom contains psilocybin and psilocin. It's illegal to possess anything that contains psilocybin and psilocin. So just accidentally collecting Pluteus salicinus with no intent to consume it, you've broken the law. And these are Schedule I drugs with the most severe penalties. They're treated like heroin. Now here's the Nocebi calamastrata. Notice the bluing at the base of the stem and sort of the blue-green in the stem. This mushroom is loaded with muscarine. It does not have psilocybin or psilocin at all. So this is what I'm talking about. You have to avoid mushrooms that are naturally blue-green, thinking they're hallucinogenic. There are a few species of the Nocebi that do contain psilocybin and psilocin, but I've never seen any of those in the Pacific Northwest. And the ones that do contain psilocybin and psilocin don't contain muscarine. Now, muscarine causes perspiration, salivation, lacrimation, vomiting, diarrhea. You think you're going to die, and for about a week you're going to feel like you're going to die, but you will recover. But you do not want to experience eating an Nocebi. Now here's my most important mentor, Kit Skates Barnhart. Some of you have been introduced through Kit, through her picture key. And Kit was really fascinated by the hallucinogenic mushrooms and desperately wanted to try them. So at the very last mushroom conference, it was held at Brightonbush, the hallucinogenic conference, I picked about 200 psilocybe semilanceata in the median in the parkway at Evergreen College. Now, nobody paid any attention to me. I had a Schedule I drug license, so technically what I was doing was legal, except that I took these mushrooms with me to Brightonbush so that I could finally try them, and along with Kit, and see what the effects were. And I was sharing a cabin with Gary Linkoff, the mycologist who wrote the Audubon Guide that I mentioned earlier from New York, and Linnea Gilman, a Colorado mycologist. So just after dinner one night, we sat down and each consumed 15 psilocybe semilanceatas. Now, if you remember back to the picture of R. Gordon Wasson taking his dose from the curandera in Mexico, it was 6 pair, it was 12 mushrooms. And I calculated, knowing the chemistry of the mushroom that he consumed in Mexico, that 15 of these liver caps would have the same effect as 6 pair of the psilocybe that Wasson had consumed. So Kit and I and Gary and Linnea all consumed our 15 mushrooms, and we had Maggie Rogers, another friend, a librarian and author, who was the observer. And within a half hour, 45 minutes, Linnea and Gary were just giggling and laughing and so excited, and they went off to this lecture over at the main lodge at Brightonbush. And the lecture was by Terence McKenna about how mushrooms were really alien beings, the psilocybe mushrooms, coming from outer space. But Kit and I felt nothing from our 15 mushrooms. And we waited an hour and we sat there and we were very, very disappointed. So we decided, well, we really wanted to experience the mushrooms. So we each took 30 more, giving us a total of 45 mushrooms. So we're now at 3 times a normal dose of psilocybin and psilocin, and we waited and waited, and nothing happened, and we were very, very disappointed. So we took one more dose of these things, another 30, another double dose. So, and then we walked over to the lodge at Brightonbush to experience this lecture from Terence McKenna. And so here's Terence McKenna, and he's talking about how possibly human brains had enlarged, because as they followed ungulates around and pursued them to hunt them, they would see these mushrooms growing on ungulate dung and consumed the mushrooms, and the mushrooms expanded their mind. That was not what Terence was talking about that evening, but he was talking about his theory that these mushrooms had come to the Earth from Mars to colonize this planet. And Kit and I, listening to the lecture, Gary was up front and just heckling the heck out of Terence McKenna. And we're looking at each other, absolutely no effect. We're feeling nothing. And somebody was passing around a big bag of psilocybe cyanensis. So I reached in and took a huge handful of the psilocybe cyanensis, and I ate those down, and I sat through the rest of Terence's lecture. He talked for more than 2 hours, and at the end of the lecture, I walked out, and again, no effect. Kit was feeling nothing, no effect at all. We're very disappointed. There's a guy standing on the front entrance to the Brightonbush Lodge, and they had this big bag of psilocybe cubensis. So I reached in and took as many as would fit in my hand, and I munched them down as I walked Kit back to her cabin, and Maggie was with us. I said goodnight to Kit and Maggie, and then I went and met another researcher who was working on and eventually was able to determine the structure of baocystin. And I was a winemaker. I love wine. I made wine for 52 years. And this friend from the Bay Area has a really wonderful and famous Bay Area wines. So we sat and we drank 3 bottles of three different nice red wines. And everyone in the cabin was just sitting around, totally spaced out, totally gone. And at about midnight, I just said goodnight to my friend and went back to my cabin. Again, I'm just totally disappointed because nothing had happened. You know, no changes in the vision, no changes in how the outside world looked, feeling completely normal. I laid down, closed my eyes, and tried to go to sleep. And then it struck me. Suddenly, I just left my body, was floating out into space. There was these beautiful, gorgeous kaleidoscope blue visions, the exact blue of those scanning electron micrographs that Paul Stamets had taken for years at Evergreen. And after about 20 minutes of these visions and floating in space, I got panicked and I said, how am I going to get back to Earth? How am I going to get to my body again? And I opened my eyes, and as soon as I opened my eyes, everything was over. Everything was back to normal. So I got up, put on some clothes, went over and knocked on the door of the cabin where Kit was staying with Maggie. Kit and Maggie both came up. Kit desperately wanted more mushrooms because she'd had 90 Liberty caps with no effect whatsoever. And I laid down and I was describing the visions to Kit and Maggie when Gary Linkoff and Linnea returned to the cabin. And they also listened to my narration. And after about 15, 20 minutes, I would again feel like I might not ever get back to my body again, open my eyes, and it would shut down. So this went on for about an hour, and then everyone went to bed, and I tried to sleep, but it was very, very fitful. And then exactly 6 hours after the last mushrooms I had consumed, I just sort of felt this big pulse in my body. I kind of jumped, and it was all over. I was back to normal. I went to sleep for about an hour and a half. And then at breakfast, I sat down with Paul Stamets and Andy Weil, and I told them what I had done, how much I'd consumed, and what had happened. And their eyes just grew wide with disbelief. But right after breakfast, I had to leave to head up to my vineyard in Houston. I still living in Olympia, but I had grapes planted, and I had a meeting coming up with soil conservation people about some work I wanted to do on the land. So I got in my Volkswagen Squareback, and I was driving, and I got about 10 miles from Brightonbush, and suddenly I could no longer control the car. I just couldn't keep it on the road, and I got very, very panicked. So I stopped the car and just wondering what I'm going to do. I got out looking around, and then I looked at the left front tire, and it was completely flat, completely shredded and gone. I put on the spare, drove on home, and everything was sort of normal, except for the following year. If I even read about drugs in drug experience, I would break into cold sweats, and I had decided that this was the biggest mistake I'd ever made in my life, was to try all of these mushrooms. And it wasn't until many, many years later, actually 2010, when I started to write about these mushrooms again and talk about them again, I realized that I had been changed permanently from these mushrooms. I became a much more sympathetic and empathetic person. I cry more easily, but I connect much better to people than I did before experiencing them. So these annual conferences ended in about 1985. And then in 1999, Paul Stamets organized a Mycomedia End of the Millennium Mushroom Conference to be held at Brighton Bush. So Ken Kesey came with his bus and his band, the Merry Pranksters. Andy Weil and Jonathan Ott were there. There's Christian Ratch and Sasha Schulgen. Sasha's the inventor of ecstasy and a number of other rather nasty drugs. And here we are, all of us got a chance to ride on the bus and experience the bus in this 4-day philosophy mushroom bash. Here's the entire group together in a group photograph. I'm sort of in the middle of the front row, a half balding guy, and Andy Weil is standing directly behind me. You can recognize his big bushy beard, and just to the right of him, with one of Paul Stamets' signature sweatshirts on, is Gary Linkoff. Many other people. I can see David Aurora in this picture, and many names that some of you would know about. And after that, in 1999, I thought no more about mushrooms until 2010. And Britt Bunyard, the founder of Fungi Magazine, wanted to write an article about psychedelic drugs, about mushrooms that cause strange visions. And he asked me to do an article, in fact, 2 articles for Fungi Magazine, which I did do. But the interesting thing to me was reading about, in the Oregonian magazine, this individual in Vancouver, a clinical psychologist, who had gone for treatment, psilocybin treatment, to deal with his depression over kidney cancer therapy. And and that's when I first recognized how the mushrooms had changed me and could change many people. And I finally accepted my first invitation to go to Telluride the following year. Telluride is an annual conference held to celebrate the psilocybe mushrooms. I'm in the Amanita muscaria mask in the lower left-hand picture. Britt Bunyard of Fungi Magazine is in the picture just to the right of me with the tall hat on, and Katie was his manager. And then here's the big parade at Telluride. Now, almost everyone at Telluride does mushrooms. I've only done them one time. Once was enough, and I'm not afraid to do it again. I just have no desire. I like being in control rather than being succumbing to the mushrooms for any period of time. And Paul Stamets was at this particular Telluride conference as well. They tried to get me to come back almost every year, but I haven't been inclined to. So here's the article in Fungi Magazine with the 2 articles by me and the one by Gary Linkoff, the article to the left, the issue to the left. And Gary also writes his view of that exact same night at Brighton Bush, where he used the mushrooms with me. And then more recently, in 2016, there was an article in Fungi Magazine proposing that churches start using these mushrooms in their religious ceremonies because of their potential to increase empathy and make people feel better towards each other. And starting in about 2000, the research began again on psilocybin. Psilocybin, along with marijuana, had been made illegal in the right around 1970, and it came from basically the hatred of Richard Nixon for blacks. He was looking for an excuse to be able to send police officers into black communities, and he also wanted to get back at the anti-war protesters, the peaceniks, the love groups that were interfering with the Vietnam War and making him look bad. And so these, both psilocybin and marijuana, were made illegal at that time. And research didn't begin again until around 2000. It's all privately funded. There's no federal funding available. But currently, there's 53 clinical trials going on. And this is just a summary. I don't expect you to be able to read it, but on the screen, a summary of the various things that are being researched right now. And it's primarily being used to deal with PTSD, to deal with alcohol abuse disorders, to deal with spousal abuse disorders, to deal with depression at the end of life due to cancer. And here's some of the papers that have been published on psychedelic healing, psilocybin, meditation, mystical experience, religious effects, and many other intriguing effects of psilocybin and psilocin. I consider these two drugs, psilocybin and psilocin. And psilocybin in the body is quickly converted to psilocin in the stomach, so that's the active ingredient. And it's there's nothing that compares to psilocybin in what it can do to relieve the effects of PTSD. And this is a drug that you tend to use on rare occasions. It's not a drug that you use daily or many times a day, or even it's occasionally. But the other thing that's happened in very recent years, and this is informal research, is microdosing. People feel if you take about 1/10 of a psychoactive dose of psilocybin, they're also doing it with LSD, it really increases mental productivity without adversely affecting behavior. And so there's a lot of work going on with microdosing, but nothing that I can find yet in terms of a formal clinical trial. These are all anecdotal reports that you can find on the internet about microdosing. And Paul Stamets has come up with a very interesting theory that if you combine psilocybin with arysamine analogs, and arysamine is going to be coming from Hericium arenaceus, and you add some nicotinic acids to that, you can actually increase the production of neurons and potentially even heal Alzheimer's disease. And so this is a very interesting proposal. In Asia, the Hericium species are used in dealing with Alzheimer's, and they appear to be used with considerable good effect. And if you want to see a detailed discussion of mind-altering drugs, how to change your mind literally and figuratively, get this book by Michael Pollan. Michael is a very famous author with many, many books, Botany of Desire, and this one I think is a game changer. When I was in California in 2019 to talk about psilocybin, Michael asked to join me for dinner at Berkeley, where I was giving a talk, and we had a very nice evening, and I strongly recommend his book, How to Change Your Mind. So, in summary, I think an important way of eliminating excessive loyalty to one's own nation, group, religion, to make people kinder, more empathetic, and more open towards each other, psilocybin can play a critical role, and it's needed today in this country far more than ever. And it's also a potential route away from our addiction to heroin, and opioids. Because psilocybin is not addictive, and indeed, if the people that tend to abuse it and use it again and again, its effects tend to wear off. It is not entirely safe, mind you. There have been people who've had visions and they've jumped off tall buildings to their death. They've waded into the ocean and drowned. So it's something you want to do with care, with supervision, but it's something that can really have a long-term positive effect, and something that I strongly feel is needed very much in our society today. Thank you.